Curated by Stephanie Sparling Williams, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, entitled The Afterlives of Curating Resistance. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Congratulations, everyone. This is the last panel, and it's a Friday, so you've almost made it to the end of the day. As Gemma said, my name is Stephanie, and I just want to take a moment to thank Erica and the Lunder Center, and also Gemma and the Yale Center for British Art colleagues and research, and just for organizing this beautiful conversation, but then also just an opportunity for colleagues to come together and to be in dialogue about this topic. And then on this occasion, at the Brooklyn Museum, so I've been thinking a lot about curating art and material culture, especially the historic art in the Brooklyn Museum's American Art Collection. In October of 2024, we reopened our American Art Wing to completely transformed American art spaces, so galleries that are looking at American art from a hemispheric perspective. I am moderating the conversation, so I probably will not be giving any kind of satisfying overview of the work that we did in this space, but I have been thinking a lot about what to do with challenging objects, thinking about how we experiment with representation in the galleries, how we bring in new voices, new perspectives, and also not new, voices and perspectives that have always existed and are, alongside and adjacent to the collections that we work with. And so, I have the great good fortune of being in dialogue and, shaping a conversation with my colleagues, Stephanie Delamar from the Carnegie Museum of Art, where Stephanie is the curator of European and American art, and also Erica Loam, who is the curator of collections at Historic New England. So I'm going to be really shaping a conversation around some of their display practices, but I wanted to just introduce myself and the work that I am really excited about. And I also want to introduce selfishly a work in the Brooklyn Museum's collection that I think is a really great inclusion, or something to think alongside some of the histories of tea. Here we have a work by Benjamin West of a really interesting character. He's a really interesting history, Peter Beckford. But this is a map that he's holding, and perhaps later, when we get into the questions, we can study this map a little bit together of a detailed shot of Jamaica. And, Peter Beckford and his family in the 18th century, was really a part of this Caribbean industry, or Caribbean sugar industry, excuse me. So I think that, thinking about tea, thinking about sugar, we've seen a lot of sugar references. This work, we have a pretty unique display. I think the study in and of itself, so this is the American Art Study, and this is just one of 8 frameworks. So the framework that we've introduced here is Radical Care. We're looking at curatorial practice, and we're actually trying to show our work to our audiences. The experiment here is we're really bringing in scholarship, right? Interdisciplinary scholarship, and putting it into conversation, direct conversation, proximity to our works in the collection, suggesting these larger, longer material histories, but also the voice, like polyvocality, of folks who are thinking in and around the objects in our collection. And so we call it the American Art Study because we're really interested in this idea of deep and rigorous consideration and thought, giving our visitors an opportunity to quite literally investigate alongside us in the collection. That QR code will link to a partnership with the Brooklyn Public Library, where visitors can check out the books that they see on display. And so there's this real kind of conversation that can be had in the space of the study. And like I said, a little later, I think as we get to the questions, there might be an opportunity for me to give you a little tour around this space and to talk about some of these juxtapositions, some of the books that we are putting into conversation with our portraits, and why we're choosing these conversations, the sight lines, the objects that we have. You can't see in this picture, but right across from Beckford, we have a tea service, and we have some silver that is in conversation with our portrait as well. So we've got a really dynamic inclusion of works across collections of decorative arts, American art, arts of the Americas, and indigenous art. Also from works from in other spaces, our photography collection, works on paper collection, even works from our feminist center. So we're really thinking hemispherically about the history of American art. But I just wanted to, this is the vantage, this is where I'm, coming into the conversation from. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what my colleagues are up to. So I'm going to sit down with that.
So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Stéphanie Delamer. I'm at the Carnegie Museum of Art, and I've been there for about 3.5 years. I'm an Americanist by training, but the position I have at the Carnegie Museum of Art is to be the curator of the collection of European and American art, by which is meant everything before 1945. And of course, it does not include only European and American art, but like we do have a curator of decorative art. We have 2 curators of decorative art and design. We also have a curator. So we have our institution has a mix of medium-based denomination, like architecture, decorative art and design, photography, and so forth. But for, I would say, what used to be, the title of my position used to be curator of fine arts. We didn't want to keep the fine because of the hierarchy that's inherent in the world. It became curator of European and American. And I was very excited about that, actually, because as an Americanist, it allows me to think about American art very globally, I would say. And not actually necessarily limiting myself to what used to be considered, let's say, European and American. And since I've been working there, I have worked on 2 projects. One of them is an exhibition that we'll bring in the conversation later on, and that was titled Fault Lines, Art, Imperialism, and the Atlantic World. And then the reinstallation of our galleries, which is opening in phases. And so the slide that you have right now on the screen is from one of our entrances into the galleries. We are not separating collections according to geography. So we have 2 entrances because our building is connected to the Natural History Museum. And so we have one entrance, like a first gallery that's at the entrance of the Art Museum. But we also have another entrance into the art museums that comes from the galleries connected to the Natural History Museum. And this is the one you actually see on the screen. And we called it Where Do We Stand? Because we wanted to take a moment for our visitors and for ourselves to think about where is it that we are grounding when we are letting art into our space. And I can talk a little bit more about what that meant for us later. And I talk about, I say us because we have been working on this reinstallation of the galleries as a team. I'm working with my colleagues in all of the different areas, of collecting areas at the museum. So I'm going to quickly pass. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Erica Loam. I'm curator at Historic New England. And for those who aren't familiar, Historic New England is a historic preservation organization. We were founded in 1910, and today we have 38 house museums across the region of New England, and I'm one of 2 curators for all of it, which is an extraordinary privilege and an extraordinary challenge. I'm going to talk about an exhibition that's actually opening next week at the Eustis Estate in Milton, Massachusetts. And I first want to sort of frame this by saying we don't have a museum venue. We have a house museum, and we have converted 4 of those bedrooms into gallery spaces. So we are in an art museum. I'm talking to 2 colleagues who are curators of art museums, capital A, capital M, and they're certainly not neutral spaces by any means. But I will also allow that my context is this is someone's home. I'm installing an exhibition in someone's home, and you cannot escape that. It is unavoidable. The walls have historic wooden mantling. They are plaster walls that make things very tricky to hang. There are knobs and buttons and all sorts of things sticking out. So, which makes a lot of sense actually for my exhibition, because it's really all about family stories. The exhibition that I've curated is called Myth and Memory, Stories of the American Revolution. It is very much in time for the 250th. And the exhibition is inspired by the fact that we have, since 1910, taken into the collection objects with family stories, family histories, and a lot of those stories have been embellished. A lot of those stories have taken on the quality of myth, and they are, filled with the memories of ancestors, and in some cases, with direct associations to individuals or events related to the American Revolution. In other cases, people have tried to fit as much as they could onto the object to then present it to historic New England, which was known at the time as the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, which is very, again, full of fun things we can talk about and unpack. But I just wanted to put that thread there to maybe pull later on about, when the name of the topic is the afterlives of curating resistance. On one hand, this exhibition is very much about my predecessors and the responsibility over the years that we, as a institution that was founded by and for the colonial revival, the responsibility and obligation we have had over the years to tell these stories and interpret these stories, and in some cases not challenge any of those stories. And as the curator of this show, I essentially wanted to myth bust our collection, and have done that by, in some cases, citing previous curators and their efforts or non-efforts to really pick apart some of these narrative threads. And I realized that I have been misstating the title of this session. I've been calling it Curating the Afterlives of Resistance, which I think is actually pretty relevant to my first example, which directly relates to the larger subject of this gathering, which is tea. This is a pewter teapot. As you can see, it's quite broken and has been repaired over the years, and it is accompanied by a tiny little pewter teacup. And by its history, and you'll hear me say by its history often, it belonged to Crispus Attucks, who was the first casualty of the Boston Massacre, and depending on who wants to claim it as the first casualty of the American Revolution, although first and last are really interesting claims to put on any object or any person. We have had this teapot since 1918. The teacup came later. And this has had such an interesting history because they have become inexorably linked to Crispus Attucks, but Crispus Attucks himself has had many afterlives. His death in 1770 was really just the beginning of his story. Immediately, used as a hero of the Boston Massacre, a rallying point for the Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere wasted no time engraving what had happened and making it part of this sort of propaganda campaign. John Adams, called Crispus Attucks the instigator of the clash between colonists and British soldiers when he defended the British soldiers on trial. And these objects were not known at the time. Crispus Attucks was a man of African and indigenous ancestry. His mother was Natick. We don't know if he was enslaved at the time of his death, although we know he was enslaved at some point by the Brown family of Framingham. And this is an important connection to make because the Brown family allegedly held on to his possessions, this teapot and teacup. And they held on to it until about 1850, when they gave it to this man, William Cooper Nell, who was a Black abolitionist in Boston. And in the 1850s, the abolition movement in Boston was really picking up steam. And it was very much run by Black men and women, Nell being one example, and Ellen Garrison being another example. And the Brown family approached the Black abolitionists with these relics, and they transformed from these sort of survivals of the Boston Massacre to these potent symbols of Black heroism, of Black patriotism, as Bostonians were looking to find patriots of color to celebrate and commemorate, as they did with the establishment of Crispus Attucks Day and all the sort of memorials. And I know we have a question about commemoration later, which I think will be really interesting. And so the process of handing these objects to be exhibited as they were, they became, sacred relics, also had the interesting effect of virtually erasing Attucks' indigenous ancestry and making him primarily a Black man and a Black patriot. Those objects remained in family hands until they were transferred to the Bostonian Society and then to Historic New England in 1918. I kind of set this up because we include the donor letters in my show. What were they writing about in 1918? The donor, who was a descendant of the Brown family, said, it might have no other value other than its association with Crispus Attucks, because why would a family hold on to a broken and repaired and busted old pewter object? William Sumner Appleton, who's the founder of Historic New England, he likes it because it's a great example of colonial pewter, and that's his thing. But subsequent curators would really latch on to this narrative thread with Crispus Attucks, and it transformed once again in the hands of Historic New England into one of the most cherished possessions in our collection. But no one has really taken the time to investigate whether the claims of ownership are true or not. And that is one of the things I try to investigate with mixed results in my exhibition.
Thank you both so much. I think what's really exciting about this conversation and about being at the end is really this panel's focus on, I think, display, but also how contemporary audiences are encountering historic objects, material culture, artworks, and how our various institutions serve as a bridge between our collections and our contemporary audiences. And that also really, we're thinking about the interests, right? The interests, the concerns, right? I think there's this language of political demand that we're all working within and around in this contemporary moment. And so I think especially around an anniversary, a moment like the 250th, I know we're thinking a lot about how people are understanding history and how people are understanding, I think you both use the word narrative, which I'm really interested to talk about, but I want to start by asking kind of a compound question, but I want you to maybe reflect. I'm curious how you were navigating the reality and contemporary impact of historic erasures, like you both have mentioned, absences and systemic devaluing that has occurred within the broader field, but of course, at our own institutions and in the collections that we've been working with, or these archives that you're encountering. And then, thinking about the second layer of this question is how might museums and historic house societies and contexts, curate objects that are inextricably linked, right, to a lot of these things that we've been talking about throughout the symposium: empire, enslavement, and imperial extraction. So I know that's a layered question. Feel free to answer at any angle, but I'm interested in about, navigating this contemporary moment, but I'm also interested in the possibilities that we have.
I like that you're talking about it as from this contemporary moment, because I always feel like even if we are historian, I work primarily in the before 1945, as I said earlier, but at the end of the day, for me, we always do history from the here and the now, right? So that's to go back to what I was thinking about when I chose this slide. Where do we stand? As we were preparing to reinstall the collection at Carnegie Museum of Art, really we wanted to emphasize. So we started with a question, and a question that we are asking ourselves as well as we're asking our visitors. In a sense that, for example, one of the things that for me is super important is we're not going to curate a collection or think about it the same way, depending on where we are and when we are, right? That's what you were, when you're looking at old files and the way that people have been thinking about an object, you're a generation or two generations later, and it's very different. So one of the questions that came up in our installation was the idea and the concept of a land acknowledgement, which is something that a lot of museums have been doing, and Carnegie Museum of Art, at least, yeah, Carnegie Museum of Art is not. And so it was a question for us in the sense of like, okay, so there was no consensus. Like that decision was made before I started over there. But that doesn't mean that we cannot ask where we are, right? And that doesn't mean also that at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that we cannot, that doesn't mean that asking how we are acknowledging our place, and our place, which might be, you know, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the United States, and then our planet simply, cannot be something that is central as we enter the museum and think about our individual positions with vis-a-vis the objects and vis-a-vis the cultural environment we are in. So we wanted to emphasize, let's say, grounding ourselves as people who work at the museum, asking the question to our visitor in a way that would include them in our reflection. And so it's a way of finding our place in some ways. We come from all different places. Obviously, I did not grow up in Pittsburgh. And I also, because we're not museum, for us, we wanted to let the art and the artist guide us. So, and that means looking at contemporary artists, but also looking at the art that we have inherited from the past. So Edward Hicks' painting that you see here on the screen from 1837 is really like a myth-making artistic practice about Pennsylvania and about the Great Treaty, for which there is actually no hard historical evidence. And at the same time, it's such a founding myth for Pennsylvania, for the Philadelphia area, but also for Pennsylvania. So it presents like a false image of harmony. It also gives it some sort of biblical dimension, because you see, it's called the Peaceable Kingdom, and you have, it's a biblical quote, but you have the Penn Treaty in the background. And it was done in 1837. So of course, at a moment where the Lenape Indians were had been forced out of their ancestral land for a time. So it's imagining this, it's encouraging the viewer to imagine this mythical peace moment that actually sort of never happened in the condition that with the stories have come to our time and to our culture. And on the right of this, we pulled the work from the 20th century collection. It's an Arthur Dove painting called Tar Barrels. So thinking about where do we stand between settler colonialism and the remnants of industrialization in some ways, because Arthur Dove's practice was to paint a lot of like the found objects that he was encountering on the side of Long Island Sound. And at the same time, it's a very aesthetic painting. So I was thinking about how in the art museum, we are really encouraged to have an aesthetic experience, which is kind of divorced from the historical conditions in which is, let me rephrase that. The art museum is founded as a result of modernity, right? So it's the art museum as this space of aesthetic experience separate from our everyday life is actually also a result of the industrialization and colonial extraction that we live in today. So it's all linked, and we wanted to ground that in the first gallery that people encounter at the museum.
Thank you.
So like I said, we are operating out of house museums, and these are homes where people were enslaved, people labored, where labor, gender, disability, queerness, stories that have been pretty much sanitized or removed from the interpretation of those homes over the years. And we are reinterpreting, reassessing, reinstalling if necessary to bring full context and awareness to those sites. And in doing so, we can approach collections and we can approach our installations in dramatically new ways. 5 years ago, we started an initiative called Recovering New England's Voices. We, as an organization, invested. We didn't take IMLS money. We didn't take federal funds, which I think is significant. We invested in our own study center and researchers, and have been sort of mining the archives as best we can to recover the stories of empire, enslavement, and imperial extractions at our sites. And what's been an interesting phenomenon is that our interpretation has sped far ahead of where our collections are, that we are telling stories at our sites that we don't always have the sort of anchoring objects that we desire to create that moment of encounter and connection. We've had to get creative in many ways. We've had to talk about everyday domestic objects like a pair of andirons and a fireplace that depict enslaved individuals, or we've had to talk about mahogany and think about the fine luxury goods at these sites. In my exhibition, I'm make an effort to create an object for a story that was too important not to tell. And that's the story of Cicero, who you can see as you walk into our third gallery, which we've called Liberty. We have very recently recovered as much as we can about Cicero's story, ... with more to come, hopefully. Cicero was enslaved. He was a young man. He was a child when he was enslaved by the Emerson family. And then when Mary Emerson remarried Jonathan Bowman, Cicero was taken with the Bowmans from Boston to Dresden, Maine, which is in mid-coast Maine, along the banks of the Kennebec River. And that's where he grew up. And Jonathan Bowman was a relation of the Hancock family. He himself was an outspoken patriot. And sometimes I think about how, in a small community like Dresden, or Palborough, as it was known, if you are inflaming your fellow townspeople with rhetoric about oppression and tyranny and slavery, how is that going to affect the actual enslaved individuals in your household who are no doubt being exposed to all of this and being influenced by it? In Cicero's case, he took his chance. November 1st, 1775, he fled Bowman House, making his way to Cambridge and on his way enlisting in the Continental Army. Jonathan Bowman quickly placed a runaway ad describing the clothes that Cicero wore with him when he left. As many of you know, these runaway ads are really the only surviving primary source documentation we have that helps us to understand the material lives of enslaved individuals. And in this case, it told us a lot of really interesting information, including helping us reconstruct his path. And so for this exhibition, this was a really interesting story of resistance, an interesting story of loyalty, as we kind of touched upon in another gallery. But all the documentation we have to tell Cicero's story belong to his enslavers or people used to capture him, including this bill that Reuben Colburn, who was the agent sent to capture Cicero, he basically kept track of his expenses because he wanted reimbursement from Bowman. And that includes everything he ate, where he went, and includes paying off the militia captains who had taken Cicero in and had fed him and clothed him and paid his enlistment bounty. And so this document we can kind of reverse engineer to track his progress from Dresden to Kittery to Newburyport to Cambridge. Unfortunately, Reuben Colburn caught up to Cicero pretty quickly. As soon as he arrived in Cambridge that very day, he apprehended Cicero and paid for two, drinks and the inn, paid the innkeeper, and they were back on their way to Dresden. And that is unfortunately where the trail ends for Cicero. He arrives back in Maine in January 1776, and the record dries up. So these are bleak clinical documents. And so we wanted to tell his story in a way that at least helped to reimagine his personhood or imagine his personhood in some way. So we took that runaway ad and we reconstructed what he wore the night he left Bowman House. We did this in a few different ways. We mixed historic garments from our collection, the breeches and the stockings, but there is a jacket he wears, as described in the runaway ad, made of ratteen, which is a sort of coarse wool that was used to clothe enslaved individuals. It was referred to as slave cloth. It is also used in furniture upholstery. It's not the kind of fine wool that you would have seen in either military uniforms or everyday clothes worn by free colonists. And so we had to essentially fabricate this material from scratch. And we worked with a weaver in Maine who, made her best attempt at it. And so we wanted everything he wore to help narrate the story as best we could, so that in the gallery, your anchoring object is not this document or the runaway ad, but the very clothes themselves to help bring him to life in some way.
Do you want to go? Do you have a...
I was thinking about that idea of liberty. And so since I've worked on it, and you were thinking about the commemoration, right? And the moment that we are in this 250th anniversary. And I thought, so I'm trying to think about, so when I did the Fault Lines exhibition, it's not, how can I put it? I did not intend, it was not a commemoration, right? But I did want to put revolution in there as something important. And actually, I started with revolutions. And I started with an object that was made in 1776 on purpose. But for example, like thinking about commemoration and thinking about how can we commemorate this important date in this country. Here, the question was actually to think about how I could go at it sideways, let's put it like that. So the map you see here is a map of St. Vincent made in Britain in 1776. But in that map, which is very, very much an object of settler colonialism in the sense that it's a map that's made after the island was ceded to the British Empire in the Treaty of 1763. It's a map that's made to prospect for new colonists to come and take some land. So it's really about showing that this part of the island is very well adapted to the cultivation of this plant, sugar, sugar, coffee, and so forth. So the date of the map is important, but in the object that it was surrounded by evoked the Haitian Revolution. And we were talking about arson earlier. When Jennifer talked about arson, I thought about this particular slide because what you see, so you see the map and I wanted to put it horizontally also so that we would come at it a little bit more as like, yeah, I want this part or like this part of the land sounds interesting. Against the background of revolt and revolution, because I was thinking about also the American Revolution in relation to the French Revolution, to the Haitian Revolution, but also to all the other revolts and uprisals that were constantly taking place in the context of the age of slavery. And what you have, so you have two large prints about the burning of Cap Français at the beginning of the Haitian Revolution. And to the left of that was like a manuscript a manuscript, a sheet of manuscript from from Pierre du Cimetière, a Swiss citizen who traveled in Philadelphia, like in New York, as well as in different Caribbean places. And the manuscript was also like a documentation of the militias. This particular one was about the militias in Jamaica. And I was thinking also about the Caribbean as the place where, from what we talked about earlier, also it's the place where money is made, right? It's a place where silver is imported, and it's a place where without the Caribbean, there is no American Revolution, simply enough. Because you cannot, the North American colonies also became, let's say, the project of the American Revolution is sustainable because of the trade that exists with the Caribbean directly. So as much as the idea of independence and its sustainability economically is also provided by the trade with the Caribbean, which is sometimes smuggling as much as, it doesn't have to be between just the British Caribbean and the British North American colonies. There's plenty of evidence of trade with Curaçao, with Suriname, and so forth. A very famous painting, Captain Carazing in Suriname, which is in St. Louis today, is all about this type of trade. So yes, I don't know exactly where that takes us, but I was interested in that idea of going sideways and thinking, my train of thought was thinking about these militias in the Caribbean and the militarization, and also the that idea of freedom as being articulated in the context of the American Revolution, and actually also in the context of slavery as being the privilege of white people, and that privilege being questioned and being claimed by people of African descent, whether they are enslaved or not. So, for example, one of the two paintings that I had in the exhibition was the portrait of Francis Williams from Jamaica, which is at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the portrait of John Turner by John Smybert, which is also at the Peabody Essex Museum. And I was thinking about Francis Williams. A portrait was probably done around 1759, 1760. But in this portrait, he's a black scholar articulating when he's commissioning the portrait, presenting himself in his library in the context of the Atlantic world. The library is furnished with books that are very well represented in other European and North American collections. He's being represented with a globe that calls attention actually to the Caribbean and to Jamaica in particular. And at a moment when so 1760 is also a moment of one of the most important uprisings, slave uprisings, the one called the Taki's Revolt. So when he was painting, when he was commissioning this portrait, the colonial government in Jamaica is actually going after black bodies and wanting to control them, to exhibit them in executions. So I was thinking about the sort of like what is absent and what is present in the work of art, and how we can think about presenting that tension, let's say, in the context of an art exhibition.
Thank you. Both of you have given us a lot to think about, especially around commemoration and what does kind of a what are the opportunities of commemoration curatorially? Like, how do we do that? How do we mark moments? How do we mark people passing through time and space? How do we honor, I think you both use the word stories and narratives. It's come up quite a bit. And I think I'm going to kind of put off a provocative, or maybe not, but I tend to think that storytelling is a trap. So I'll just lead with that. It's Friday, guys. We'll just go with it. Storytelling is a trap. But I wonder, like, what are the opportunities and limitations that you've encountered with, kind of this desire or this need to narrativize, right? I mean, a part of it is like art history. That's what we're doing. We're narrativizing for art audiences. We're giving context. But I think, in my experience, I'm always up against white supremacy, right? In all of these examples, even still, right? The anchoring, like capital H history, capital AH art history is always white supremacy. It's always the narrative. It's always the formal history. And then we add and stir these other stories, like kind of in pieces, right? And I think sometimes that's the nature, like that's the work, that's the nature of working in these materials and archives and working with these histories. But do we have other options, right? Or are there alternatives to thinking about presence, thinking about contributions that are not always positioned in relationship? So I think that, it's my question is unfair in a way, but I am curious for you to meditate a little bit on both the opportunities that you all have found. You've shared a few of those, but if you've encountered any limitations of storytelling. And then I'm really curious, do you make any distinctions, right, in your galleries, in the labels, and how you're understanding and talking about your work between histories of art or histories of these material culture, of this material culture, and kind of the narratives that you're presenting in your galleries? Like, are there any distinctions that get made or drawn upon?
Well, I'll just say that stories are our delivery system for a lot of our interpretation, because with the exception of the 4 small galleries in our Eustis Estate, we don't have labels on walls anywhere. So when you go visit one of our houses, you are being told stories by our guides, who are, obviously trained and educated, and they are, adapting to the interpretation and information we've recovered. And storytelling is very much at the sort of mission statement of what we offer as an organization. Stories are the things that we've been given and bequeathed in many cases alongside the object. So there is an interesting distinction to be made in the manner that we interpret the objects that we've been given, and stories as the objects themselves that we are attempting to pick apart and dismantle without necessarily discarding in the galleries, because they are the thing that our visitors relate to and connect to before they really begin to understand the full complexities of the objects that they are looking at. They are told the story first as we were told, as we received it. And then I go about trying to pick apart from that story, well, what can be verified as factually accurate? What can we question? What can we bring in as context to make you understand that, this is more than just a lovely piece of furniture, or this is more than just a teapot in the case of Crispus Attucks as an example. So I think we are, we take responsibility as an organization that was founded during the colonial revival as sort of tacitly supporting white supremacy. That is what historic New England was founded to do, was to enshrine a certain image of New England's past that supported the supremacy of WASPs. And we have, done as much as we can over the last, I would say, 25 years to really, without necessarily discarding that history, because it's an important history to be interpreting alongside the histories we're now trying to tell at the sites through, again, the vehicle of storytelling. And so I think I'm trying to get at that in my installation, that stories are useful as a delivery system of information, especially when you're talking about family objects that have not, their interpretation is so embedded in the object that you really, it imbues it with that sort of sacralizing power. Again, in the case of the Crispus Attucks teapot, while, we wouldn't necessarily take a busted old pewter teapot, but the story attached to it is why we took it in 1918, and the story attached to other objects in the collection are why I'm taking them in the 2020s to put on display. So and we say often when we, collect or we talk to donors, what is the story? And that is important to us, because otherwise we would just be a dumping ground for everyone's wedding dresses and china and porcelain, which we were in the past. And so the story is actually the motivating factor for us to acquire objects.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I mean, stories are powerful trap. You were saying they are traps, but they are powerful ones too, right? Because they are like, so stories for me, like, whose story are we telling? It's because it's a tool of community building, right? Community building in the sense of, and like the stories that are
really helping shape belonging. And,
exactly. So the question then maybe, so for me also, like, I think our institutions are so different because, like, I guess an art, and you can tell us also, like, an art museum is less bound to stories, let's say, than a historical institution, right? So sometimes I feel like maybe, and the question that as art museum, maybe the story that we're supposed to tell is the story of art history, which I think, that's a good one to segue into that, because the story of art history is also a powerful narrative that we have inherited, right? And it makes some choices, especially as art museums. Like, we have inherited a certain canon that build that history of art that we are telling. So one of the things that we wanted to do, and let's say a way maybe around it for me, was to think about the collection as something that we inherit. So we decided to have like to have a room that were like a gallery that we called Inheritance, which is what you see on the screen right now. And there are different ways, and actually it connects a lot with what you're talking about, because it's like those objects that carry a story, and so we inherit them, and then we are to care for them and to communicate them and to help around those objects then create something that's totally intangible, but that's based on objects and those stories. So when we were thinking about, okay, we are reinstalling this, the collection galleries, we do not want to reproduce the art history that's connected to, like the canonical art history and like the stories that we tell about them, which is mostly European art history, right? We were like, okay, so the museum is a place that has constructed it, we inherit it, and as curators, it's our job to think about how we're going to present that inheritance to the public. So it was a way for us then to collect things, like impressionist paintings. We had, like, there is a Monet London Bridge here, which was also a way to talk about actually inheritance as like atmospheric inheritance, because if you look at that painting very closely, you realize it's very industrial, what you see in the background. And aesthetic also, we inherit a certain way of looking at beauty. And so we commissioned the artwork you see in the back on the wall to an artist, Louise Lawler, who was very interested in institutional critique. And she, by taking a photograph of a plaster cast, she's first of all looking at all the plaster casts that are existent in the American collection, but also she's really changing the angle from which we look at the statue, which is implying that things can change. And so that's kind of what we were interested in here, looking at this is what we have, but that doesn't mean we have to look at it the same way. And one of the objects that was very important for me to include here is the statue of the Victory statue, which is coming from the St. Gaudens's Monument to Sherman in New York. Because it's a very problematic statue in more than one way, which we inherit in the collection. But if you dig a little bit into the story of the creation of the statue, which is celebrating Sherman's campaign in Georgia, the scorched earth tactics that Sherman later on used against the Plain Indians to eradicate their culture, which is, also part of our inheritance, right? But the model who modeled for the statue was Hetty Anderson, who was a black model who worked in New York. And when you look at the statue, if you don't know that, you'll assimilate the aesthetic of her body to a white aesthetic. And so how do we think about all of the dimensions that are inherent in the collection that we inherit, to question and to think about? Because the inheritance, let's say, especially I'm thinking in terms of museums, we rely on gifts as well. So the inheritance, let's say, what's the difference between an inheritance and a gift? An inheritance is something you did not necessarily choose. Mm-hmm. But what you can do is what you do with it, right? That's kind of where your agency lies. And to me, it's kind of like a lot of what the curatorial agency lies in some ways.
Yeah. Do you mind if I slide through a couple of these? Oh, did you want me to stop?
That's sort of another example that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think it really exposes what you're talking about, the limitations of storytelling as an effective means of communicating information, limitations and opportunities, and inheritance versus gift, because this is an object that was specifically made and packaged to be gifted as a souvenir. This is a piece of wood, neatly squared off. It belonged to a corn crib that was one of the surviving structures on a farm that was part of the Royalton Raid of 1780, which was a joint Indigenous and British raid on the town of Royalton, Vermont. It was one of the sort of last efforts in New England to, the Mohawk was working with the British to sort of repel, in some cases, to sort of devastate this region, to weaken and destabilize it so that the British could make their further encroachment during the war. And this was, the corn crib survived and lasted until the early 20th century. And around 1920, it was finally taken down, and Mary Johnson was probably lined up with other people to get their souvenir. And she inscribed the story that she wanted to tell about this object, which is, set on fire by the Indians at the burning of Royalton, Vermont. And so that she proudly gave it to us pretty much that year. And so we don't have objects in our collection that really help to tell the Indigenous perspective of the American Revolution. And of course, there was not one monolithic perspective or motivation, especially, even among the Iroquois Confederacy. You had nations who tried to remain politically neutral, who allied with the British, who allied with Americans. And for, the members of the Mohawk and some Wabanaki who allied with the British, political autonomy, the reclaiming of ancestral homelands, these were all motivating factors. But all of that is pretty much hidden and obscured and elided by an object like this, which has this white woman, she is telling the story, and that becomes part of the museum's record of that incident, which is the only, object we have to interpret this important event. And, I'm trying to combat this narrative. I'm trying to combat the 19th century's, narrativization of this event. And so, again, it's the limitations of an object like this, because it's still an object that is very much a product of its colonial revival commemorative culture, which was very much about, putting a white supremacist perspective on everything. And at the same time, how can I use this as an opportunity to tell a story or communicate some facts of history in my gallery that our visitors might not be aware of, and to center as much as I can the Indigenous perspective of this event that has been very much become enshrined as part of this local lore for this town.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both so much. Before I open it up to audience questions and conversation, I'm going to be a little selfish. I'm going to slide through to the end. We have a lot of things to look at, but I wanted to share. So at the Brooklyn Museum, like I think most institutions, our audiences are pretty generous with their feedback, but our community members in particular are very generous, and we take their feedback really seriously. And I really appreciate working in an institution where we're constantly in dialogue, like in thought partnership with our audiences. Brooklyn has some pretty, before my time, groundbreaking initiatives where they seek engagement with audience. One is our Ask app, or for a long time, audiences could just ask questions and people would answer in real time about works in the gallery. So we have this whole database, or we have this collection of questions, right, that the audiences were really curious about. And I think one thing that became, and when I came into the position, my predecessor had been awarded some grant material or grant support to fund like focus groups in the American art galleries to get a sense of how people were experiencing the collection. And it was really fascinating. I think nothing would surprise any of us in this gallery, but in this lecture room about some of the things that they were experiencing and thinking. But I do think that what was interesting is how our audiences then, but even our audiences in this moment too, I think are really interested in quote unquote, the truth, or what is the truth. And I think that's very complicated, and we get to decide and navigate as scholars, as curators, what kinds of truths we want to convey. But I do think a lot of the time our audiences want to trust, right, that we are sharing information, or that we're presenting work in a way that allows for this idea of complexity, right? And that we're acknowledging that either we don't have all the answers, or we are co-creating the answers that matter, right? And so I think that feels really, where that felt really interesting when we were imagining this study. And I'm just gonna, I'm highlighting, I was sharing kind of the entry, how you get to this piece, and that this is the sightline. So this work by Agostino Brunius is in our American art study, even though it's it's in our European painting collection. We took this, so we were experimenting. All of our labels don't look like this. In fact, only the labels within the study take the question answer model as kind of an experiment of trying to get at some of the things our audiences might or have expressed explicitly wanting to know about this painting. So questions like, who is pictured? Who was this made for? Why is this interesting now? And, thinking about the details, thinking about race, thinking about color, and how it gets played out in this painting, I think is just one way that we're inviting audiences to think critically with us. And so again, just a reminder, this framework very specifically was interrogating the curatorial process itself. All the frameworks didn't do this, but this one really thinking about this idea of curatorial care as like, how are we caring for our objects at the same time we're caring for audiences, giving audiences a window into kind of curatorial and scholarly inquiry. This kind of came out of not a resistance to kind of narrative or linear kinds of storytelling, but as a way to kind of get at what at least our contemporary audiences seem most interested in. And I think that's what I think, to your point, Stephanie, about, and I think Grace Lee Boggs, an activist and cultural theorist, she asked this question, like, what time is it on the clock of the world? Where we have these collections, but we get to decide in this moment, today, the moment that our audiences are navigating, what we do with them, right? And how we're thinking about them. This can change tomorrow, right? The painting remains in the collection, but our interest and our engagement, we can come at it from a different angle, right? We can ask different questions. We could put it into conversation with different texts. So if you notice in the case below, we've kind of objectified these texts that are central in Black American art historical discourse. So thinking about the contributions of Sarah Lewis, Lisa Farrington, in this case, thinking about vision, thinking about race and history as a way to suggest alternate and like infinite readings, right? For that this painting can be knowable otherwise, right? And so I want to open up, we have 15 minutes left, and I want to give the audience a chance to join us in this conversation. You saw we had a lot of really great slides that we didn't even get to, so perhaps, your questions will spark opportunities to look at other material, other things. But yeah, I thank you. I don't know if I think, let's see if the audience have any questions, but then of course you all are welcome to respond as well. Any thoughts? It's Friday, the last panel. Oh, we got that.
Thank you very much. I really liked the ending that you talked about curatorial care and like asking questions rather than answering them for people. But I wanted to pick up on the point of like white supremacy and the inheritance of things and inherited bias. So I'm wondering how in many of your examples, the collaborators that you worked with, the diverse voices that we're using other than your own, and also how you were making those kind of temporary exhibitions or the issues with no labels, how you're making those voices permanent.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I will just, before I turn it over to the panelists, I'll just quickly, at the Brooklyn Museum, in our galleries, this idea of polyvocality, it takes different shapes in different forms. It like comes and goes in different ways. So, in this space, we have labels that are written. So we have a variety of ways, right before, right dead in the sightline, you see a text on the wall, the quite large text. That's the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. That's really framing our understanding of this indigenous epistemology of gratitude, thinking about our understanding of land, sense of place, landscape through this indigenous epistemology for the land. So I'm just highlighting that one. We also, you hear from conservators in a material sense throughout the galleries. We engage with the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens to ask them to provide insights and reflections on our like for example, in the framework to give flowers, where they're thinking about, they offer these new windows into the collection through their point of view and perspective. In some cases, we're talking with indigenous artists, quill workers who are quill, who are doing quill work to reflect on our historic quill work in the collection and about how work is made. In another framework, we're tapping drag queens to help us think about self-fashioning in our historic portraits. So their voices, understanding and recognizing drag as a rigorous practice of self-fashioning and kind of critique, and how we can use and understand their perspectives as informing our engagement with our historic portraits. And so we at least feel that these perspectives add something and delight, and again, and offer our audiences a chance to access the collection in ways that, one, they weren't. We had this data based on their feedback. But also, I think that they were ready to have different kinds of experiences with the collection. And I think part of that came through those various perspectives. And I'll just leave it at that in terms of just the polyvocality. I know your question was multi-layered, but I want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to those questions.
I'll jump in and say, we're at our houses, there's a kind of privilege and responsibility in knowing that a visitor who's going to take a tour of one of our houses is going to place their trust in our guides and they're going to believe essentially what our guides are telling them. And that is a privilege and responsibility that has been and will probably continue to be abused because, you are dealing with human beings with their own biases, implicit or otherwise. But, as curators, in the absence of labels where we can revise and continually recontextualize the objects they're looking at, the best I can do is offer as much as I can to our guide staff and to our site managers so that they can create interpretation and tours that align with where we are as an organization and our sort of mission and goals. And ways we do that, for example, could be that touching upon Portsmouth. We have a number of houses in Portsmouth with very fine furniture. And a lot of those furniture, we know the cabinet maker of record for a lot of these pieces, Langley Boardman, for example. But we also know that Portsmouth had a free Black community of artisans who we know documented, worked on some of our houses as carpenters. It's very likely that at least some of those free or formerly enslaved or still enslaved Black artisans worked on the nice mahogany furniture that came out of Langley Boardman's shop, which is not a route of investigation that has really been taken yet, but can infer based on information we already have about other aspects of our house museums. Inside my gallery, where I do have a bit more curatorial control through the mechanism of a label, I do my best then to invite skepticism, invite doubt, because I can show what these donors wrote when they offered their objects to us, and I can put their words on the wall. So there is not that weird invisible gap between when an object entered in the collection and then when it went on display in an exhibition, which sometimes can span 70, 80 years of being in a museum and being shaped by curatorial biases and authorities. So in some cases, I want to just cut that out and say, well, this is, in the words of the person who donated this to us, this is what they thought the object was and the story they told us. And then invite people to question it alongside me, the curator. That's the sort of point of my show, is that I'm questioning everything, and to show my work of to what extent can I recover some sort of factual or essential truth about these objects or the people that were associated with them. And in some cases, my efforts are inconclusive and I have more questions than answers, and I make that known to the visitor as well.
So it's interesting because I find that we go towards, it seems like we are sort of going towards transparency about what the curatorial work is, and we want to sort of put it as part of the exhibition in some ways, right? In the study area at the Brooklyn Museum. And I was thinking one of the challenges for me of the museum is the sort of visual apparatus, because I see, when we think about white supremacy, there is also the sort of surveillance part of it, right? And so I've been thinking about how I'm going back, because there was a slide with this one. When I did the Fault Lines exhibition, one of the major concerns that I had was I was thinking, well, okay, so if the Caribbean region is such an important place in the world at that time, and it's transforming the world, but we have so little about it, or so little traces materially in terms of artistic creation. And these are botanical drawings by John Tiley that are at the Hunt Institute for Botanical Research at the Carnegie Mellon University. I was thinking about those as drawings that I ended up being aware of throughout conversations as I was researching the exhibition. And I was thinking, so John Tiley was a Black artist who was working in the St. Vincent Botanical Garden. And there's very, very little known about him. But there's a significant amount of his work that has survived, partly in Pittsburgh by sort of chance, right? And partly in England. But then I was also at the time researching not the work, because the work has probably been destroyed, but the work of José Antonio Aponte, a Cuban artist who was also involved in a rebellion. So it's kind of like rebellion and art. And the work that he did, we know, was definitely connected to to imagining different possibilities, basically for the world, imagining different histories of the world from his perspective as a Black craftsman, a sculptor, and a carpenter, and also a soldier in Cuba. And so I was like, how do we, like in some ways, how do we integrate, or how do we, it's not integrate actually, integrate is really wrong as a word I'm thinking. It's more like, how do we make space for Aponte, for John Tiley, and should we do it visually or should we do it differently? And so in this particular exhibition, I decided, well, maybe like I wanted to make space for their presence in a sound piece rather than something visual. I worked with a colleague of mine in the museum who wrote a text about, so inspired by the trial record of Aponte's trial, basically. That was where he was asked questions about the work, the book of paintings that he'd made. And so she wrote a text, but the idea was like, I was thinking, okay, so we'll never know what Aponte's work looked like. Maybe thinking about visibility and power structure, maybe it's not, we don't need to see it. Maybe the point is to think about how to integrate it as part of our imaginings of the world, or imaginings of the past. So that's why I went for the sound piece, and the sound piece was designed so that it would not be there all the time. It would come in and come out, come in and come out. I wanted the visitor basically to be, maybe it's a space that I felt I was, sort of like having an echo of someone who lived, who created, who imagined the world. It's not recuperable. Like we cannot know exactly what he was thinking, but we can imagine the presence being echoed somewhere, somewhat in our days. And so that's what.
And create an experience, right, for audiences to have a moment of recognition, right? Or
just for me, it comes in and out.
Yeah.
I was,
and I think it's an experiment, right?
Like yeah.
these things that we all are trying to do, I think are experiments in what's possible. And I think it's encouraging the more curators experiment, right? And I don't think we'll always be successful. And that's why we continue to iterate. We continue to try to pull, from our collection and bring, again, like to kind of begin or end as we begin, like as bridges, right? We serve as kind of bridges, interpreters, compass for navigating and coming into contact and experience with these works in the collection, and also imagining what's possible in the absence, right? I think part of what was so interesting about the kind of moment of the pandemic and kind of the cultural reckoning, as folks are calling it, within institutions and museums, was it really, I think more and more people were starting to get creative with what was possible, because we had these collections and they had so many absences, right? Or they had so many gaps. And I think it takes collection building, as we all know, takes a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resource. And I actually, don't subscribe to the hard and fast rule that these things don't exist, right? We just haven't found them yet. And so in the interim, we're creating possibilities, right? Or we're holding space. We're making space for other kinds of experiences as we still do the work, right? To recover, to collect, to build, right? Like, I don't think curators should throw up their hands and be like, it's just not possible. Like, there are only like 3 oil painters, and we've got them. And it's like, we got Joshua Johnson, and, we kind of checked these boxes. Like, no, they're, people who have been strategically marginalized had different access to the modes of production And we devalued that production in such a way that we are now having to recover and then conserve and then resuscitate, like we're having to do a lot of labor, and that labor takes a lot of time and resource. And I think holding space for both that necessary work and then also experimenting with the possibilities of representation beyond what we actually have in the collection and what we might be able to find or know. And I think that I really appreciate that about both of your work, and I feel really inspired. And I think that this is a really good way to end because I think we're out of time, right? So I don't know if there's. Yes, thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.